All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Christine. I'm with Waterloo Public Library, and I'm here with Matthew Vandenbusshe, who is a local mead maker here in the Waterloo region. And, thank you so much for joining us for doing this.
Not a problem. Glad to be here.
Great. So before we get started with the Q&A, Matthew actually made a batch of mead on Sunday, and I was able to film him doing the process. So we're going to run that film, and then we'll take questions about anything you saw in the video after. So please put them in the comments or the chat section, and I'll be able to get to them, and Matthew can probably answer them at the end. All right? So here we go.
So hi, my name's Matthew. I've been making mead for about 10 years. Got kind of started on a bet. I was primarily doing ciders and beers before that. And this is kind of something interesting that you can't really find in the stores, at least within Ontario. So it's a very different type of alcohol, and if you take your time, you can produce something extremely tasty. So looking over what we need to get started, you're going to see a table that's covered with a bunch of tools. And I've got a lot more tools than you necessarily need because it makes it easier for me. Fundamentally, all you need is yeast, something to clean it with, honey, water, and time. The container that you need needs to be able to have some sort of cap or restrict entry of external material into it. We'll be using what's called a water lock, which you can get in most brewing or wine stores. They're very common. And all they do is it's a bubbler that lets carbon dioxide out and nothing else back in, critically. So the last piece of equipment I want to talk about with you is a hydrometer. I'm not going to be giving you specific measurements in this video when we do this talk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show on here where I start at and where I finish. And I'm probably actually not even going to show you that because this is my recipe, and I want you guys to figure out a recipe that works for yourself. The hydrometer measures the density of water. So at 1.0, the hydrometer will sit in the water and float at this level. If we add sugar to the water, it's going to make it more dense, and denser water is going to push this up. As this goes up, it's going to let us know how much sugar is in the water. And if we look on here carefully, there's going to be a potential alcohol measurement. And that'll let us know that once we ferment out completely, how much sugar is going to be remaining. As the yeast eats the sugar in the water, it's going to poop out carbon dioxide and alcohol. Alcohol is less dense than water, so this is going to start to sink back down. Depending on how much alcohol we produce, you're going to find this sinks below the 1%. So if you look on here, 0 can actually sit above the 1 line. We will be starting by just scrubbing and cleaning everything with soap and water and prepping. So we will be cleaning our demijohn. I'm going to clean a mix container. I am going to be heating some water to mix our mead in because sugar dissolves better in warm water. And we're also then going to be sanitizing each of these. I am going to sanitize my oranges. Yes, I'm going to sanitize my oranges because I don't want whatever's on the outside starting to ferment what's on my mead. Then we will start by likely juicing the oranges, mixing the honey into a concentrate in there, adding it into our, we'll call our fake demijohn or our oversized keg, and we're going to measure out our specific density, gravity. At that point, we will add more water or honey based on the measurements. Cleaning. So I talked earlier about cleaning, And we're really trying to sanitize things, not sterilize it. So we're trying to get our containers clean enough that we don't have a substantial amount of any other type of microorganism in it. So, we're aiming for 99%. We don't need to do the 100. In this, there are a number of things you can use that you might likely have around the house. One that's a little harder to get a hold of that works really well is hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is nice because once we start adding water and stuff to it, it's going to neutralize and it's not going to leave a flavor around. Another common one you have in your house is Javex. And Javex can work as a really good sanitizer, but you need to do a rinse afterwards. And if you're doing that, it's best to boil or have some sterile water on hand that you can clean with. We'll be using something called Star San. It's a food-safe sanitizer. It foams. It's a no rinse. You're going to see I have a large jug of it, and I'm going to use a very little amount to mix into a very large amount of water that will produce a sanitizing liquid that on contact, as long as it sits wet for about a minute, will clean everything to the level that we need it. Before we do that, we're going to be scrubbing everything down because it's not going to remove it's not going to remove food material or particles. And if it can't get into behind something or behind a particle, it's not going to get to sanitize it. So it's really important that we also beforehand clean everything very well just with soap and water.
Remember, sanitize everything.
So remember, this is a chemical. I'm going to emphasize this because chemical burns. Read the safety sheet. Read the instructions. Understand how you use it. Higher concentrations are not better. Yes, this might not be much stronger than Javex in some degrees, but Javex is a chemical again. Make sure you dispose of this properly. This particular stuff, yes, it's okay to go down the drain. Depending on what you're using, you may need to neutralize it first if you're using something like hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide will damage your plumbing if you dump it down. Be careful. These are chemicals. You've got it. Good. Let's continue. What is mead? Mead is an alcohol of honey and water. 2 ingredients, right? So it's honey, water, yeast. In that, both our honey and our water is very important. We can't use tap water because of the chlorine that's added to it. Chlorine prevents the growth of yeast and other bacterial elements in it, which is great for our environment, but especially us eating, so we don't have foodborne diseases. But it's not so great when we're actually trying to cultivate a bacterial environment for a specific set of yeast. Your water is also going to play an important role because it is 80% of the liquid that it's going to make up. So choosing your water is important. I have a spring that I go get my water from. I find it tastes a little sweet. It's got a nice mineral content. But in the store, getting distilled water will be very flat. It won't add anything. Or different bottled waters, or even your regional water. So your tap water, you can use it, but you have to let it sit out for at least a day or two for the chlorine to evaporate. If you use peaty water, you're going to end up with peaty water. So consider your water carefully and where you get it from. Honey. Your different honeys will have different flavors in it. If you get a buckwheat honey, you're going to end up with something that has very grassy notes and tastes like buckwheat once you're done fermenting. If you get a cherry honey, you're going to get notes of cherry. If you get a store-bought or commercial honey, you might find it ends up being very flat because they go and mix lots of different honeys together and they filter out a lot of that other material. Now, in my case, I want the flat taste. I want the honey, and I want just that pure honey taste. I am going back and I am adding some fruit to my mead. and this is something you can do. Different fruits will add different flavors to it. In our case, we're using oranges. And oranges, when you take away all the sugar from them, gives a nice citrus and a nice floral note. Let this sit. And as that's sitting, we're going to start with our honey mixture. So this is going to change for everybody. I'm going to add a lot of honey and then start mixing things up, and then I will adjust as I go along. I have a specific gravity that I will be targeting, but it will be likely different than what you guys are going to do at home on a smaller scale. So I will leave that to you. You got a shot earlier, so remember, when I set this in the water, it's going to sit at 1. I'm going to raise it up to the point where I think I want it to be, so that once it finishes fermenting out, I get both my alcohol and a bit of sweetness left over. Okay. Exciting part. Honey to container. So you'll see honey here on the spatula. If we're to mix this up in the container or just at room temperature, it takes a lot more work. Adding just a little bit of heat, and we're not talking about even getting it to hot. We're just warming the honey up a little so it dissolves a little easier in the water. There we go. So we've got most of our honey into the container there. I'm just trying to recover the last little bits, as honey is expensive and the more you can use. Now we are going to add our oranges that we've dealt with. So it's going to come in, and well, I'm juicing them. You can do what you want with them. And right now I'm facing a problem that I do not have a sterile surface, so I have to move. Yes, that is important. You accidentally contaminate what you have, you may not end up with tastiness. Now, I'm being extra careful. I'm trying to get you to be extra careful. The reality is, people have been making wine and mead for millennia, definitely at least millennia, and finding it. And really, wine, you don't need to be this paranoid. Mead, you really don't. You just want to make sure that you're doing it well, and you'll likely end up with something tasty. The other thing to remember is, if it's not tasty to start with, it's not going to be tasty to end with. Got it up to about 1.16. Which, with what I'm doing, will give me a nice sweet mead. So on that, how are we going to transform sugar into alcohol? We are going to use yeast. Specifically for this, we're going to be using a champagne yeast, Lathin 1118. It's a very common yeast out there. The trouble with it that you have to be careful with is it's a high proof yeast that ferments up to 18%, which means you're going to end up, unless you're careful, with a very dry mead, which might be tasty. You may want to start off using some other white wine yeast that ferment lower, and that'll give you a nicer flavor. There are as many yeasts as there are stars out there. There are different yeasts for flour, for breads. There are different yeasts for beers, for, say, sake, for white wines, for red wines. And brewers generally guard them pretty heavily once they get a batch going. The key that we want to do is we want to get up to 9% alcohol when we're doing this. And the reason for that is bread yeast and the environment has two different types. And this is really what we're fighting against. We're fighting against creating our own colony that'll, eat up the sugar and poop out alcohol and carbon dioxide, giving us a lovely, flavorful drink. And what we want to stop happening is there's a second type of yeast in the environment that eats alcohol and poops out vinegar. So you screw up, you can make some really nice vinegars if you leave them for another year or so. The key level is about 9% alcohol. At 9% alcohol, the yeast that produces vinegar can no longer grow. So our goal is to make sure our environments are clean enough that we can get our alcohol up to 9% before something else takes hold. So last things to do is we're going to add our yeast. Probably not going to do that on film, as since I've been heating it, it's a bit warm. We need to let it cool down first. And then, as you can see from the mess that's on the table, we've got a bunch more cleaning to do. Tidy up. Okay, talk about fermentation. So once we get everything going, we're going to have three critical things that affect our fermentation cycle after we add the yeast. The first is going to be temperature. Yeast is kind of like, well, think about it like kids, and we're pouring them into a bunch of sugar. And if they eat really too quickly, they're going to poop out a lot of smelly stuff that we don't want. At the same time, if it's too cold, they're not going to eat quick enough, and something else is going to come along that we've been talking about preventing and potentially eat and take over. So too cold increases your chance of vinegar, too hot increases your chance of something that, won't taste very good. So we're aiming for about 20 degrees Celsius, maybe a little colder, which makes both spring and fall optimal times for brewing, because we get this nice kind of cool weather. The last part is we're going to have a primary and secondary fermentation. You're only going to see me do a primary fermentation here, or start with primary fermentation. That's going to be, we're going to mix everything up, we're going to add it to the container, and we're going to let it go. That fermentation cycle is going to last anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. At that point, it's going to die down, and we're going to transfer it out of the current container, and we're going to transfer it into a new sanitized clean container. You're not going to get to see me do that, but it's an important step. As the fermentation goes along, the yeast is going to be producing a lot of material. It's going to be reproducing and then discarding. Old yeast is going to die, and it's going to build up the bottom along with our different fruits and other things. At the end of that cycle, we're going to end up with a sludge at the bottom, and we don't want to pick that up in our aging process because it has a lot of potential off flavors to it. The second fermentation is going to take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, and you're basically looking for it to finish and clear. At this point, if you're in beer or you're wanting to do like a sparkling mead, you can bottle it and add a bit of extra sugar. You need to calculate that carefully. Too much, and you can have explosive results. Pressurized bottles. After that point, I'm going to continue to age my meat. So I'm going to transfer it again, and it's going to sit. And it's going to sit till it tastes like I want it to. And for me, I find that takes anywhere from another, 12 to 18 months. So yes, we're talking about 2 years for the meat that I make. It doesn't mean it's not tasty or completely drinkable after 2 to 3 months. It just transforms to something special that you can wait longer. So last step before we finish doing all this, make sure you remember to write down everything that you just did, so you have a record for it, because you will not remember in 2 weeks, and in 3 months you'll definitely not remember. So you may end up with a dry mead, and maybe you want to add a bit more sugar to make it sweeter. Maybe it was too sweet, and you want to make it a little less, more dry. One of the fun things about making alcohol is playing with it. Don't start with big batches. Start small, work your way up, have fun, make something tasty. Take care.
All right. So that gave us a little bit of insight into the process um, that you used to make the mead. Now, I'm fortunate enough to have some mead here, and you can see it's a lovely golden color. It smells both honey and floral, as you say. You tell me what you like about this mead. Why this particular mixture?
So one, I'm sensitive to bitter, so I have a sweet tooth. So it's a bit sweeter than a lot of commercial meads that you'll find. It's also much smoother, and that's part of letting it sit for so long and why it takes so long to ferment. It's also got, because of the orange and because of the fermentation length, a bit of sourness to it, which cuts the sweetness nicely. And then, as you said, the floral and then the fruity notes to it. It makes something very pleasant that a lot of people tend to enjoy. And the other part is it doesn't taste alcoholic. You know it's there, but it's not like burning or yelling at you that this is an alcohol.
So out of curiosity, what percentage would this be?
I think this one that we're drinking is around 14%. It's a strong wine. It's why we have a small amount.
Mm-hmm.
It's an aperitif, so something you drink after you've eaten, kind of as a dessert. Um, it's not like your beers or other things that you're going to sit down and have with a dinner or something large. It's something you're going to sip and enjoy with your cake or ice cream, and it's going to stand on its own and against it. Uh, yeah, it's, well, as you know, as you're probably tasting, it's very tasty.
It
As I
is.
keep saying tasty, but
And how has the flavor profile changed over the 2 years? What sort of, if I were to brew this myself, what stages might I expect it to go through before it gets to this point?
so when you ferment, in addition to the alcohol and the carbon dioxide, you're going to get esters, different hydrogen groups, oils that give flavor. So if you think beers, your different types of beer, one of the big flavor differences in them is because of the different esters and products that the yeast produce. In this case, because we're doing a high alcohol proof wine, it tends to put off things that have kind of a medicine-y note to it and just a slightly stronger nose. And it takes a while for those to go away. That's at the end you'll pick up, when you transfer the last time at 6 months. Before that, you'll have yeast flavors like bready, potentially, because the yeast is still either suspended or it hasn't filtered out completely. And it really depends on what you get. As I said, I'm much more sensitive to those things, so I go a lot longer. I know a lot of people enjoy their meads after 6 months, and they're really good. I'm willing to wait a little longer.
Nice. So I've got some questions here for Matthew, and I'm going to keep asking them. But if anybody out there watching wants to put in a comment, I can certainly see. Well, Matthew is certainly happy to answer those. So please feel free. But moving on, my next question is: where can you buy mead? Now, you said you can't buy it in Ontario, but you must have tasted it somewhere to get you interested in it.
So the LCBO has started carrying it. There's people who started mixing it with ciders that you can find in the LCBO these days, but it's a lot harder to find. there are meaderies within Ontario that you can go to, and if you look them up, and a lot of them are within southern Ontario. Very nice drive in our wine region, and they'll be happy to sample and to taste. The other really good place to go is Quebec. Quebec makes a lot of meads. And I hear that they're much more prevalent within the SAQ, which is their LCBO. But I haven't got the chance to do that firsthand. I keep getting them given to me.
Fortunate gifts. And so was it a Quebec mead you tried for the first time?
It was. Trying to remember. It had a bit of a wine quality to it and a bit bitter, but it was a sweet mead again. Two friends brought it back after a vacation, and it was quite enjoyable, and kind of got asked why couldn't I make it, or I bet you could make this. And so I went off and did it. I'd been making ciders beforehand primarily.
Awesome. So in the video, you use this massive keg. And while we were doing this, you talked a little bit about the pros and cons of using a big keg. And unfortunately, those didn't make it to the final video. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that here?
So I was using the large container primarily again because it takes 2 years, so I do larger batches now that I've worked out a recipe that works. That keg is nice because I can set it up in a corner and I don't have to worry about being gentle around it, where some of the glass demijohns and that you find, 2 years of time sitting in your basement or a large container can lead to, well, I've had some explode on me. When somebody dropped something or hit them, fortunately they were empty. I couldn't imagine if I had a full one. And so these just sit nicer in a way. They're a bit harder to find. I just happen to get really lucky with them. Yeah.
All right. The other thing we didn't get to show on the video was the process of adding the yeast. I know we saw some pictures of the yeast sort of proofing, and you took a temperature there. But do you want to explain a little bit more about what that process looks like?
So I was using a dry yeast, so usually you need to rehydrate it before you add it. The rehydration occurs for this particular one between 35 and 37 degrees Celsius to reactivate it. So what I did was I took just a bit of our must, our final liquid. I heated it up to that point. You sprinkle the yeast on top and you let it sit, and the yeast will rehydrate. It'll start to form foam and get really active. Takes about 20 minutes in this case. At that point, stirred it up and then dumped it into the keg, to the demijohn.
And then you just wait.
I closed it up and waited. By the next morning, it was bubbling happily away. Yep.
Super. One of the other things that didn't make it to the video was you talked a little bit about stalls. So what is a stall and how can you avoid them?
Stalls are where the fermentation process stops sooner than you expect it to. So you want your bubbler going at a constant rate. So I showed you that little container, and bubbler is just, you have a bit of water in the bottom of it, and as gas escapes, it pushes a airlock inside up, and it bubbles. A stall is where that essentially, again, stops happening. Usually that occurs because the environment is not optimal for the yeast to grow and it's gone dormant. Common ones is that it gets too cold. So right now, if you leave it overnight, it'll slow down or it might stop until it warms up again. So temperature. Another one is that you might not have mixed up enough air. If it happens later on, usually this is the case, where there's not enough dissolved oxygen in the mixture. And at that point, you really only have an option to either transfer it, or if you don't get to and you ignore it, you may find it starts to go sour and will turn into vinegar. So pay attention as you're doing this. Well, just check on it every day. It's kind of growing. And you can sterilize another container if you have one and transfer it out and just try to froth it. That's really all you can do at this point.
Okay. What do you record when you're starting a new recipe? We saw you sitting there and writing down some things.
So right now I record what I'm making, the volume, date, a rough weighting of all my ingredients by mass, and then the specific gravity that I start with along with the yeast that I'm using. Additional things that I did when I started beginning the process would be I take measurements of the temperature that I started adding the yeast to it. I might record the temperatures at night. I would also record my cleaning process and my steps because especially when I was doing ciders and I'd produce them at a more rapid rate, different cleaning, different sanitization can leave different subtle other flavors. And so it was interesting for me to track that as well. You're really doing a scientific process. And if you want to do it repeatable, then you need to record your process and everything you do. Until it becomes a standard procedure for you, it's best to record everything. Just keep a log.
Yeah. Great. I think you mentioned once to me that honey is an antibiotic, that it actually, you can't just like dump yeast in there. The honey won't let it live very long. Is that why you use the fruit?
So yeast is actually a fungus, which is something interesting. It's not a bacterial. But outside of that, there are some chemicals within the honey that do prevent bacteria growth. It's also got it's slightly basic. So it doesn't have, it's not a 7, which is what most things live in. It's closer to, I think, a 5-ish in the pH scale. And then the last thing is it doesn't have a lot of water in it, so it's got a lot of sugar. And so common ways that us humans preserve food is we either smoke it, so we add nitrates, we salt it, or we add sugar and bring up sweetness. So at a certain level, if you add enough sugar to something, things won't grow. For us, the quickest way to get rid of that is dilution. So our water that we add, it both takes down the sugar level, so brings it into something that is a happy environment for our yeast to grow in. It also will cut the acidity down, because again, we're diluting it in a large volume of water, and any of those bacterial properties we do as well. One of the reasons I add the orange, though, is, at least from my belief, it adds we'll call it vitamins and fiber for the yeast to grow off of, because honey doesn't have a lot of those other things to make a complete diet for it.
All right. So you said you've experimented around to get this recipe in particular. So have you had any big failures?
I have lost a $200 batch of maple wine that didn't ferment quick enough and it stalled. It's now 4 years later. It's a very, very nice vinegar. It's just a really expensive one. I've had various ciders and meads go off. Generally, when they go off, because of the alcohol and the content, it's not going to go off in a funky kind of way. As long as it smells like something you'd want to eat or something in your pantry, you're probably okay. If you see green or black mold, dump it out. If it smells like your gym socks, dump it out. Otherwise, I find if you take the risk and just ignore it or leave it even longer, sometimes wonderful things happen. These are living systems. So what happens, happens. Yeah.
So you've done similar, or you've done this process with maple as well, maple syrup, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, same process. It's just sugar.
Yeah. Did you add fruit to that one as well, or?
I did not. I'm a little more careful with maple syrups that I get. There is a nice one that a small producer out Uxbridge Way does, and they use a lot of different tree saps, so it gives it a nice cream soda kind of taste to it. It's quite unique. I find the Mennonite darker ones, they're nice, but because they do them in the iron pots, they're much more bitter. They pick up the iron notes to them. So again, like honeys, depending on where you get them and who's processed it and how, you'll get different flavors.
Neat.
Yeah.
All right. Well then, I haven't seen any other questions come up in the chat box. If anyone has anything to add, kind of last second, last chance. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming and sharing all your knowledge with us. It's been great to learn all this. And I look forward to hopefully trying a whole lot more different kinds of mead in the region in the future, if anyone out there is going to get started brewing something.
My pleasure. I'd be most
Thank you.
interested to see more out there.
All right. And thank you everyone for watching. And have a great evening. And, as Matthew said, make something tasty. Cheers.
Cheers.